came to David and told him and said unto him, Shall 7 years of famine come into thee in thy land? Or wilt thou flee 3 months before thine enemies while they pursue thee? Or that there be 3 days pestilence in thy land? Now advise, and see what answer I shall return to him that sent me. David, you got 3 options for punishment. Now notice, not a single one only involves David. David's actions not only have consequences for David, they have consequences for all of the people in the nation. People who had no involvement in the sin that David had committed. And yet his decisions had consequences for those innocent people. What a lesson for us, and we'll notice that a little bit later. So David's now got to make a choice. And these are the options before him. Well, what is David going to do? Well, he begins to consider the situation. And I want you to notice his thought process in verse 14. And David said unto Gad, I am in a great strait. What that means is, I don't know what to do. Well, you reckon? You've gotten yourself in a big mess, and you've gotten your nation in a big mess. And now you've found yourself in a situation that it's not going to be easy to get out of. You know, there are people who find themselves in positions of power, positions of authority, and they tend sometimes to get this false sense of confidence that there's never any situation they can get themselves into that they can't get out of. And maybe David had convinced himself, you know, God's seen me through this. There's really nothing, you know, it's going to be a slap on the wrist. But he finds out that that's not to be. And so he says, I'm in a great strait. Let us fall now into the hand of the Lord, for His mercies are great, and let me not fall into the hand of man. So really all David does is narrows down his 3 options. He says, let me tell you which one I don't want, God. Don't let me fall into the hand of man. So in other words, I don't want my enemies chasing me. Okay, so that one's out. I'm just going to put myself in your hands, put myself in your mercies. And really what we're going to see is that was a good decision. If David knows anything at this moment and by this time, he knows that God is a God of judgment and that God is a God of mercy. God has shown him in his life both judgment and mercy. He commits the sin with Bathsheba, and the immediate consequence is he loses that child. So he knows God is a God of judgment. He knows that there are consequences for his behavior, but he also understands that God is a God of mercy. And so he puts himself in the mercy of God and puts himself in His hands to do with what He will. So what happens? What is the completion of this event? Look at verse 15. So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning even unto the time appointed, and there died of the people from Dan even to Beersheba 70,000 men. Think about that. 70,000. And I wonder, would it have been any less or any more had David chosen another? I imagine they all would have turned out pretty much the same, right? That the end result would have been loss of life, death, because of David's poor decision. God metes out His punishment. 70,000 men from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south. Verse 16. And when the angel stretched out his hand upon Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord, it says, repented him of the evil. Now, does that mean that God did something wrong and He repented? No, it means God changed His mind. And think about the situations in Israel's history where God had intended to do something, but because of His mercy, He had changed his path and His direction. You can think when Moses came down off of Mount Sinai and he saw that they were erecting a golden calf and they were worshiping it. That God said, let me alone, I'll destroy these people and I'll raise you, Moses, to be a nation. And Moses pled on behalf of his people. And God changed His direction. He changed His action and what He was going to do. And so what we see here is God's mercy represented. David said, I'm just going to throw myself at the mercy of God. And God demonstrates His mercy. The Lord repented him of the evil and said to the angel that destroyed the people, it is enough. Stay now thine hand. and the angel of the Lord was by the threshing place of Araunah the Jebusite. David calls for mercy. And I want you to notice what he says specifically in verse 17. And David spake unto the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people, and he said, Lo, I have sinned, and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, that is, these people over whom I am placed, what have they done? Let thine hand, I pray thee, be against me and against my father's house. If there is any redeeming qualities in David, it's number one, that ability to see and recognize and confess his own sin. And number two, to be willing to shoulder the responsibility of his actions. I am willing, David said, to take the brunt of this responsibility. Do not take the lives of these innocent people any longer. And that's certainly admirable in the life of David, the completion of this event. You pick up in verse 18, and how this ends is also pretty interesting. Gad came that day to David and said unto him, Go up and rear an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And David, according to the saying of Gad, went up to as the Lord commanded. And Araunah looked and saw the king and his servants coming on towards him. And he went out and bowed himself before the king on his face unto the ground. And Araunah said, Wherefore is my lord the king come to his servant? And David said, To buy the threshing floor of thee, to build an altar unto the Lord, that the plague may be stayed from the people. Now Araunah did an admirable thing next. What did he do? He said, Let my lord the king take and offer up what seemeth good unto thee. Behold, here be oxen for burnt sacrifice, of threshing instruments, and other instruments of the oxen for wood. All these things did Araunah, as a king, give unto the king. And Araunah said unto the king, The Lord thy God accept thee. I'm just going to give them to you. Don't pay for this stuff. And here's what David said. The king said unto Araunah, Nay, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which dost cost me nothing. David said, I'm not going to give God the free stuff that you give me. I'm going to give Him what I pay for. What an admirable quality. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver, and he makes his offerings on the altar there. So we see the context, the choices, the consideration, and the completion. And so we've run through that pretty quickly, and it certainly is an interesting story in the life of David. What lessons can you and I take from this? Well, here's the first. Understand that Satan can only accomplish in you what you let him accomplish. You ever hear anybody say, the devil made me do it? I wonder if Judas was ever tempted to say that. You see, because in Luke chapter 22, verses 3 and 4, it says, Satan entered in to Judas Iscariot. So what does that mean? Does that mean he was possessed by a demon? No. What that means is Judas adopted the path that Satan laid before him. Satan provided the temptation, and Judas made the decision to take it. And much like we see with David, Satan moved David, a number of the people. What does that mean? He placed a temptation before him, and David took it. And that's what happens with us. After all, in James chapter 4 and verse 7, resist the devil, and what will happen? He'll flee from you. Satan placed before David, placed before Judas, places before us temptations, enticements to do evil. But it's up to you and me to take them or not. You see, we have the freedom of choice. And David made a choice, and his choice was wrong. And we need to understand tonight, and this may be one of the most important lessons that you learn from this event, choices have consequences. The actions and decisions that we make have consequences. And one of the things that I try to tell young people as often as I can is the older you get, the more consequences your choices have. Good consequences, bad consequences, depending on the decisions that you make. But the older you get, the bigger the consequences. Because the bigger the decisions that you have to make. And the more people who are affected by your decisions. How shameful it is when adults make decisions with absolutely no consideration of the consequences that it has on other people. Had David paused for just a moment to say, what will my decision to number the people do to the nation? Do you think he would have done it? If he had known 70,000 people will lose their life if I make the decision to number the people, he never would have done it. But that's the problem. He didn't stop to consider that actions have consequences. Choices and decisions always bear consequences. And David believed halfway through or three-quarters of the way through that he could just stop the action and all of a sudden the consequences would go away. But that's not how life works. And you and I need to understand the same. Actions always have consequences. In Ecclesiastes chapter 11, it's interesting what the inspired, wise man Solomon has to say. And he's talking in particular to young people, but it applies across the board. In verse 9 he says, "And moreover, because the preacher was wise," this is chapter 11 and verse 9, not chapter 12 and verse 9. He says, "Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes." Essentially, Solomon says, you know, young man, you really can do whatever you want to. You can. You can make whatever choice you like. But I want you to notice the caveat that he puts at the end. "But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment." Can you do whatever you want to? Absolutely. You're free to make whatever choice you like. But understand that choices have consequences. For all of these things, God will bring thee into judgment. 2 Corinthians 5:10, "We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that every one may give an account of the things done in his body, according to that he hath done, whether it's good or bad." We're going to stand at judgment, and we're going to have to answer for every choice we've made, and every decision we've made, and every action we've undertaken that's not cleansed by the blood of Christ. Every one. Choices have consequences. And those consequences affect you and me and all of the people connected to us. And sometimes people who are completely unrelated to us. One of the things that I enjoy doing, I've always enjoyed it, is taking small stones and skipping them across a lake or a pond. I love doing that. It's so fun. I've done it my whole life. You know, and every now and then you get one that's too big to skip, and so you just chunk it. And sometimes when I was a kid, I would see how large of a rock I could take and hurl into the lake. And the clunk that it would make when it splashed into the water. And then the ripples that would go all throughout that body of water. Every action, every choice, every decision that we make has ripples that reach places we could never imagine. David could not have foreseen the damage he would do with that one mistake. And that was true in all of David's life. The sin with Bathsheba haunted him his entire reign. The consequences of it. Choices have consequences. And then let me say this. You know, even after your choices, in a sense, you can choose your punishment. Well, what do I mean by that? And you don't get to control the consequences of your actions, but you can in some measure control how long they last. Let me tell you what I mean by that. You can choose to suffer for eternity because of your choices. You absolutely can. In 2 Thessalonians 1:8-9, "In flaming fire taking vengeance on them that know not God and that obey not the gospel." You see, if I make a choice, that choice has consequences. And that choice can have eternal consequences. But I can choose to make it right, can't I? I can choose at some point in my life to seek forgiveness for my poor decisions, for my sins, for my transgressions, and I can find forgiveness. That doesn't guarantee that the physical consequences will go away, but it certainly does prepare me for eternity. But I can choose, and some people make this choice. I can choose never to make that right, to carry that sin with me into eternity. And I can choose, therefore, to let it plague me for all eternity. I can choose that punishment. Or number two, I can choose for an extended time on this earth needlessly to suffer. I can say, you know, I've committed this transgression, and I can carry it around with me and carry it around with me. And have you known people who did this? They carried their transgressions around with them nearly their whole lives, and then as they're facing the end of their lives, they finally decide to make it right. Now, we rejoice with those folks. I will never forget Noah Woodley, Mr. Noah Woodley. By the time I met him, he was in his late 80s, probably. And he was a small man. And every time I went to see his wife Clara, who was bedridden, he was sitting in the same chair, and he almost looked like a statue because his face never changed. He never said anything as I walked by. He was always sitting in front of the television in an old dusty shack in Irving College Community. And I would go by his little chair, and I would go back, and Miss Clara had a room on the back of that shack, and she had a hospital bed there, and I would visit her. And as I came back, I'd say something to him, and he'd just nod or wouldn't say anything and go on about my business. Well, Clara Woodley passed away. And one day we got a call from the lady who sat with Mr. Noah. It was right after services, I believe, or may have even been during services. She showed up at the building and she said, Noah wants to be baptized. He'd lived his whole life in rebellion against the truth, doggedly determined not to do the right thing, with a wife who was good as gold, a godly Christian woman. And he'd been by her side physically their entire marriage, but never would obey the gospel. And then he lost her. And he came and he spoke to me for what was probably the first time of any consequence. And he said, I want to see her again. By that time, he was in a wheelchair. And I'll never forget, we put him in a folding chair. And he was so tiny, we lifted him up over the wall and we set him in the baptistry. And we tipped him backwards. And we baptized him into Christ. It was a great day. But why did he have to do that? Why did he have to wait so long? He chose his own punishment, didn't he? He punished himself for years. Why? Why did he do that? But praise be to God that at least he didn't wait too long. But you know what you can do? You can choose to say, I'm not carrying it around at all. You don't have to carry your sin around with you most of your life. You don't have to carry that burden and that weight. Maybe you want to go ahead and get rid of it. Again, what was David's saving grace? What was his soul redeeming quality, it seems? But his ability to acknowledge his sin, to shoulder the responsibility, and move forward. See, in that way you can choose your punishment. I've made a decision, and whatever consequences in this life come, that's fine, but I'm going to make it right with God. And I'm going to choose not to carry the spiritual consequences of that sin around with me for my entire life and carry them into judgment. And I'm not going to strap them to my back and walk around with them for the next 30, 40, 50 years and then eventually decide to make them right. I'm going to do it right now. See, you can choose your punishment. And I wonder if maybe there's someone within the sound of my voice tonight who needs to do just that. Maybe you've made a choice that you now regret. And you know that that choice is leading you to destruction. It is never too late to repent of that. David realized in the midst of the consequences of his actions that he had done wrong. And he did the best he could to make it right. And he shouldered the responsibility and he took the burden of blame. And he faced his God because he knew that he was a God of judgment, but he was also a God of mercy. Do you know you're standing before the very same God right now? A God of judgment, but a God of mercy. What punishment will you choose? Will you choose to carry it with you into eternity? To carry it with you now for days or weeks or months or years on? Or will you let it go right now? If there is sin in your life and you're not a Christian, that's exactly what you need to do. You need to lay aside that sin. You need to find the blood of Christ. Both young people that I spoke with today, I asked them, I said, why do you want to be baptized? And in various different words, but with the same gist, they said, we want to have our sins washed away. Your friends, they know that. The Bible teaches that. Acts 22:16. Do you need to do that? But maybe you're a Christian and you've carried around some great burden of sin. And maybe tonight you say, I don't want to carry it any longer. I'm ready to lay it down. We can help you. You can find forgiveness through confession. Confess that sin as publicly as it's known. We can pray with you and for you, and you can be forgiven. Choose your punishment. Obey the gospel and be restored as together we stand and sing.